My name is Emily, and I never expected the first crack in my family to come from laughter. But when my sister humiliated me at our parents' dinner table, mocking my love life like a punchline, I realized this rivalry ran deeper than teasing. She didn't know I was engaged, and she definitely didn't know I was about to fight back. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I'd love to know how far this story travels. The dining room looked like something out of a Southern living spread. Candles flickering over our mother's bone-white tablecloth, soft jazz from a Bluetooth speaker tucked behind a vase of dahlias, and the smell of rosemary chicken wafting from the kitchen. It was the kind of evening my mother prided herself on hosting, intimate, classy, and filled with the illusion of harmony. I sat between my parents, Robert and Ellen, dabbing my mouth with a cloth napkin I didn't need. The mashed potatoes on my plate had barely been touched, but I kept pretending to savor them. And then, just as the glasses clinked and laughter floated above the table, Lauren's voice cut through like ice water. "At 35, you're still single, huh?" she said, swiping a piece of bread like she hadn't just thrown a grenade. The table erupted in chuckles, polite but sharp. My father chuckled too loud. Our mother pursed her lips in that "let's not ruin dessert" way, and I felt every eye flick toward me with that same old look, pity wrapped in amusement. I smiled. I actually smiled. "I'm fine with that," I said evenly. What I didn't say was that 2 weeks ago, Daniel knelt on a rainy sidewalk in Midtown with a ring he'd designed himself. What I didn't say was that I hadn't told anyone yet, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. Lauren would make it about her. My parents would act surprised and then pivot to something safer, like the weather. So I just smiled and stabbed at my mashed potatoes, listening to the scrape of silverware and the sound of my heartbeat roaring in my ears. Lauren, my younger sister by 2 years, had always had a gift. Not for kindness, not for diplomacy, but for aiming right where it hurt and disguising it as sisterly banter. "She's just joking," Mom would always say when I was younger. "You two have such different personalities, that's all." Right. And arsenic just has a different personality than sugar. I reached for my wineglass and took a slow sip. Daniel's face flashed in my mind, how he always knew when I was hurting, even if I tried to hide it. He'd told me, "You don't have to carry them forever, Em. Just because they raised you doesn't mean they get to break you." But tonight, I wasn't ready for rebellion. Not yet. Tonight, I would play the role they knew, Emily the good daughter, the accommodating one, the one who didn't make a fuss. "So," my mother chimed in, clearly eager to move past the awkward silence Lauren's jab had created. Lauren's thinking of applying for that position at the marketing firm downtown. "Isn't that exciting?" "Oh, yeah," Lauren said, flipping her hair like it hadn't just cut me open. "I mean, it's not like I have a wedding to plan or anything, so might as well work on my career." She looked at me when she said it. Not obviously, just enough. My ring sat in the tiny velvet box in my purse. I changed the subject to the garden out back. Dad launched into a story about the azaleas. And for a while, the conversation floated around me while I smiled, nodded, and felt my future shift slightly under my feet. Because if there's one thing I know about Lauren, it's that she doesn't tease for fun. She probes for weakness. And she just gave me the perfect reason to finally show her I wasn't weak. The click of our apartment door felt like the release of held breath. I kicked off my heels and collapsed onto the couch, curling my legs beneath me. Daniel was right behind me, jacket already half off, his eyes scanning me like a doctor quietly assessing damage. "She always knows where to dig," I said into the cushion, voice muffled but edged with heat. "Always, and everyone just laughs along like it's charming." Daniel sat beside me, stretching an arm behind my back but not pulling me in just yet. He always waited, gave me space to come to him. That was one of the things that made me say yes. "She's threatened by you," he said simply. "That's all it is. You've built your own life without their help. That scares her." I snorted. "Please, she's not scared, she's smug. And now she gets to remind me in front of everyone that I'm the weird spinster sister." "You mean the weird spinster sister who's engaged to a moderately handsome software engineer?" A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth despite everything. "Moderately." Daniel grinned, finally pulling me into him. Extremely, but I didn't want to sound arrogant. We stayed there for a moment, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on my shoulder, the city glowing behind our window like a different world. "You know what I think," he said eventually. "I think we should stop letting them have the upper hand. Let's surprise them." I pulled back slightly. "With what?" "Let's host a dinner, a formal one. We'll invite both sides of the family, introduce everyone, and share the news the way we want to." My stomach fluttered. "Are you serious?" He nodded. "You deserve to share your happiness on your terms, Emily, not as a punchline at someone else's dinner table." The idea rolled around in my mind like a pearl forming under pressure. A formal dinner, our news on our timeline. And the most poetic part, Lauren would have to sit there and smile through all of it. A warmth bloomed in my chest, not vindictive exactly, but clarifying. If I was going to marry Daniel, start this new chapter, I needed to stop asking my family to meet me halfway and start standing exactly where I belonged. "I want to make the invitations myself," I said, sitting up straighter. "Handmade, personal, real wildflowers, dried and pressed, like the ones in that meadow we found on our Asheville trip." Daniel tilted his head. "Are you going to make me press flowers with you again?" "Only the fun parts. The rest is mine." We got to work the next day. I spent the morning browsing art stores, hunting for parchment paper that felt like memory. I bought twine the color of worn rope and collected sprigs of baby's breath, lavender and forget-me-nots. Each invitation was its own little keepsake. No printed templates, no generic fonts. Just love stitched into every fold. Daniel made a guest list with names in elegant calligraphy, while I arranged the flowers like tiny bouquets on the covers. We worked side by side at our kitchen table for hours, music playing softly and flour from our dinner biscuits still dusting the counter. By the time we were done, my fingers were stained green, and Daniel had hot-glued one invitation to the table, but we were laughing. The next morning was quiet and bright. I walked to the nearest mailbox with a bundle of finished envelopes tied in satin ribbon. Each one held our story. One Lauren had no idea was coming. As I dropped them into the metal slot, a thought flickered across my mind. Would they even come? But I pushed it aside. This wasn't about their reaction. It was about reclaiming the story before someone else decided how it should go. I stood there for a moment longer, my hands empty but my chest full. Let them laugh. Let them say what they want. I was about to give them something they never saw coming. 3 days passed without a word. I kept checking my phone like a teenager, refreshing my inbox, scrolling through texts. Nothing. No one had RSVP'd, not even with a polite "can't make it." The silence itself was its own kind of response. Then on the 4th morning, my phone rang. Lauren. The name flashed on screen like a storm warning. I let it buzz twice before answering, pressing it to my ear with the odd hope she might, for once, surprise me. "Emily?" Her voice poured out like syrup, too sweet, too shiny. Oh my gosh, those little invitations were adorable. So artsy. A pause, then came the blow. "But we're not coming." The words landed sharper than I expected. I blinked, standing in the kitchen barefoot, the scent of drying lavender still clinging to the air. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Mom and Dad said it's just not their kind of thing," Lauren said, voice still sweet but laced with triumph. "Too formal, too. I don't know, fussy, you know how they are." No, I knew how she was. But I gave her one last out. "They said that, or you did." A pause. "Oh, Emily, don't make it dramatic." And just like that, it began. She launched into one of her well-practiced monologues, how I always turned simple things into events, how Mom didn't want to feel pressured into dressing up for show, how Dad preferred barbecues over sit-down dinners, and how this just wasn't our family's vibe. "It's like you're staging a performance," she said flatly. "It's a dinner to celebrate an engagement," I said quietly, "not a Broadway musical." "Well, it's not their kind of celebration, so, yeah." Her voice was smug now, wrapping itself around the rejection like ribbon on a gift. "You know, it might help if you didn't always need everything to be so meaningful. Not everything's about you getting applause, Emily." There it was, the real undercurrent, the jab she'd been dying to say aloud. I stood frozen, my hand still gripping the phone, my other brushing across a petal that had fallen to the counter. "You could have just said no, Lauren," I said. You didn't have to wrap it in poison. Her tone shifted in an instant. Oh, come on, don't guilt-trip me just because they don't want to go to your weird dinner. So they're not coming because of you, I said, connecting dots aloud now. You got to them first. Emily, seriously, you always make yourself the victim. It's exhausting. My jaw clenched. I handcrafted invitations with real wildflowers, I said. It took me days. All I wanted was one evening where our families could meet and feel like we were all part of something. Real, she scoffed. Honestly, I thought the flower thing was overkill. Daniel probably didn't even care. He helped me with every single one. Silence. Then she laughed. Okay, whatever. Enjoy your flower party. The call ended before I could speak again. I stood in the kitchen for a while, the silence rushing back in like a tide. The sunlight outside had shifted, gone flat and dull, the way it does right before rain. On the table, a small tray of unused petals sat drying beside my tea. I brushed my fingers across the surface and watched one flake apart in my hand. Daniel walked in just then, tie loose from work, a hopeful smile on his face. Any word from your parents? I shook my head. Lauren called. He didn't ask what she said. He just stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. I'm sorry, he whispered. I pressed my face into his chest, letting myself sag into his strength. They're not coming, I murmured. Not her, not my parents. He just held me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. I looked over his shoulder at the invitations still stacked in the entryway, the twine bows perfectly tied. Each one represented a piece of hope carefully assembled. And now, useless, rejected, discarded. But as I stood there, angry, embarrassed, betrayed, I felt something simmer quietly beneath the heartbreak. Not despair. Not yet. Something else. Resolve. The host led us through the warm hum of the Italian restaurant, past soft golden lights and the scent of basil and butter. I held Daniel's hand a little tighter than usual, trying not to let my nerves show. This dinner wasn't what we had planned, but it was ours now. Waiting at the round table near the window were two strangers and a familiar warmth. Daniel's parents, Marjorie and Stephen, rose to greet us, smiling like we'd known each other for years. Emily, Marjorie said, her voice velvety and warm. It's so good to finally meet the woman Daniel keeps talking about. Her hug surprised me. Not just the gesture, but the way it lingered like she meant it. Stephen shook my hand with both of his grip firm but kind. We've heard all about you, he said. Especially your obsession with wildflowers. Daniel laughed beside me. Told you they'd bring that up. We sat, menus opening like stage curtains, and the conversation began to unfold, light, curious, real. They asked about my work as a freelance botanical illustrator, not in that polite, dismissive way I was used to from my family, but with genuine interest. You really paint every petal by hand? Marjorie asked. Yes, I smiled. I lose hours to it. It's meditative. That's beautiful, she said. It's rare to meet someone who creates things with their hands these days. It felt like breathing after holding my breath too long. The waiter came and went, bread was broken, and the candles flickered gently as dusk began to press against the window panes. About halfway through dinner, as I sipped my wine and tried not to be overwhelmed by how kind they were, Marjorie tilted her head. Where are your parents tonight, dear? She asked, not accusing, just curious. I froze for half a second. My fingers gripped the stem of my glass, and I felt Daniel shift beside me. Before I could answer, he spoke. Let's not push that tonight, he said gently. Marjorie blinked. Of course, I didn't mean, no, it's okay, I interrupted. They didn't want to come, my sister made sure they didn't. The table quieted for a beat. Then Stephen set his fork down, leaning slightly forward. Well, he said firmly, they're missing out. I smiled, a tight, grateful smile. That sentence, those simple words, were more comfort than my own family had given me in years. As the courses came and went, the conversation bloomed. Daniel and his dad bantered over sports, while Marjorie and I compared gardening stories. We laughed, real laughter, not the brittle kind people used to mask tension. And for the first time in weeks, I felt seen. Halfway through dessert, an espresso-soaked tiramisu I barely tasted, Daniel reached under the table and squeezed my hand. You okay? He whispered. I nodded. More than okay, actually. Because despite everything that had fallen apart, the hand-pressed invitations, the silences, the rejection, something new was being built right here between bites of pasta and warm conversation. a family that chose me. After dinner, we stepped out into the cool night air. Daniel shrugged off his jacket and draped it over my shoulders without a word. "Thank you," I said, walking beside him toward the car. "Not just for tonight, for all of it." He looked at me seriously. "You deserve to be surrounded by people who want to be there, Emily, not just people who feel obligated." The words echoed in my chest. We rode home in silence, hand in hand, the city lights blurring past the window. When we got home, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking around our apartment. The drying petals, the empty invitation envelopes, the hope I'd poured into every tiny detail. It had all started from the belief that family would show up. But maybe I was wrong about who counted as family. Maybe this was the start of something better. Later that night, after the laughter and the warmth of dinner had faded into quiet, I sat on the edge of our bed in Daniel's t-shirt, fingers curled around a mug of chamomile tea. He was brushing his teeth in the bathroom, humming something tuneless, while I stared at the wall across from me, bare, neutral, and yet still full of meaning. "I really thought they'd at least pretend to care," I said aloud, barely above a whisper. Daniel came out, towels slung around his neck, and dropped beside me without hesitation. He didn't speak right away, just wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "I know," he said eventually, and that's all it took. The dam broke. "I spent days making those invitations," I said, the words catching in my throat. "Like I thought if I made them beautiful enough, they'd show up. That maybe for once, Lauren wouldn't turn everything into a competition and Mom wouldn't pretend it was about them being busy or not into fancy things. I just wanted them to witness this, to witness me." Daniel rested his chin on top of my head. "You shouldn't have to audition for your own family, Em." I let out a brittle laugh, wiping my eyes on the sleeve of his shirt. "Well, the judges gave me a solid 0. No callbacks." We sat like that for a while. The room felt hushed, like it was listening. Eventually, Daniel shifted. "What if we didn't try to fix it?" he asked. "What if we stopped trying to convince them and just invited the people who already care?" I looked up at him. "You mean go through with it anyway?" "I mean plan a wedding that reflects who we are. Small, intentional, surrounded by people who want to be there, not people who make us beg." The idea felt radical in its simplicity, liberating even. "No fancy dinner halls." I teased, "Only if you want one. No passive-aggressive RSVP games. Only Julian, he's bad at texting back." That made me laugh. Daniel stood, walked to the dresser, and grabbed a pad of paper. "All right, let's write the real guest list, the real one. No guilt, no politics, just love." I slid under the comforter and pulled the laptop onto my lap. He handed me the list, and we started calling names into the soft air of our bedroom. "Amber," I said first. "Obviously. My best friend since college. She'd been there through every Lauren meltdown, every holiday that ended with me crying in the car. Amber had once said, 'Your sister weaponizes charm. It's not cute, it's calculated.' She saw right through the performance. "Julian," Daniel said. "He's basically my brother." He wrote with confident strokes, adding names like puzzle pieces falling into place. "Melissa from my studio," I added. "She always brings pie when I'm stressed." "Do we invite your cousin Cara?" he asked. I shook my head. "She's loyal to Lauren, more of a spy than a guest." He nodded and crossed her out before she even made the list. It was cathartic, strange, powerful. By the end of the night, we had 12 names, just 12, but it felt more intimate than a list of 100. Daniel leaned over and kissed my shoulder. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," I said. "Let's do it. Let's get married in a place that's ours, something peaceful. Outside, maybe." "I know a place," he said, eyes lighting up. "A little forest glen just outside the city. Julian and I found it years ago hiking. Quiet, private, like a secret." "I want to wear my grandmother's lace dress," I said suddenly. "It's in a garment bag in the attic. I've been saving it." Then that's settled. We drafted a message to Amber and Julian that night. "Small wedding, just love, no drama. Forest ceremony in 3 weeks. Will you stand beside us?" They both replied within minutes. Amber, "Yes, yes, yes. Tell me what to wear and I'll bring cake and backup shoes." Julian, "Tell Daniel if he cries during vows, I'm stealing his wife." Daniel laughed reading that. "He probably will anyway." I glanced around our little apartment, filled with drying petals and unfinished dreams, and suddenly it felt like everything we needed was already here. We weren't shrinking the dream. We were focusing it. No more performing for people who only show up to judge. This wedding would be about showing up for each other, and the ones who always had. It felt like the forest itself had dressed up for us. Golden autumn light filtered through the canopy in soft patches, catching the edges of every leaf like fire. Ferns curved along the trail like nature's own aisle runner, and somewhere off in the trees, birds sang a melody that didn't need rehearsal. I stood at the edge of the glen, hidden behind a small curve in the trail, my hands gently clutching a bouquet of eucalyptus, lavender, and white lisianthus, flowers I had arranged myself that morning. Amber was next to me, fixing the antique buttons on the back of my gown. "You altered this yourself," she whispered. "Emily, you look like a painting." The lace was delicate, vintage, cream-kissed with time. My grandmother had worn it in 1954, and I had refitted it over the last month with careful hands and quiet determination. Every stitch felt like defiance. Every thread said, "You don't need their blessing to bloom." "Thanks," I murmured, my voice catching in my throat. From around the trees, I could hear faint laughter, Julian telling a story, Daniel chuckling. That sound steadied me. "Ready?" Amber asked softly, giving my hand a final squeeze. "As I'll ever be." The music started, soft guitar played by Melissa's husband, and we stepped forward. As the trees opened into the clearing, I saw them, our people. Just 12, scattered in a circle like petals on a pond. Some seated on benches we'd borrowed from a neighbor's barn, others standing with cups of cider, all smiling. And then there was Daniel. In a navy vest, sleeves rolled, boutonniere clipped to his heart. His eyes locked with mine the moment I stepped into view, and stayed there, wide and glassy, like he was seeing something he couldn't believe belonged to him. I walked slowly, the ground soft beneath my flats, every step a declaration. I am not missing anything. I am not broken without them. I am walking toward something that chose me. When I reached Daniel, he took my hand without a word. Amber stepped back, and Julian, now officiating thanks to a very official $12 internet certificate, cleared his throat dramatically. "All right," he grinned. "This is the part where I'm supposed to say something poetic. But Emily and Daniel already did the hard part. They found each other. So I'll just say this. Sometimes family is who you choose. And sometimes love shows up when you stop trying to impress people who never deserved your light." The guests chuckled, but I felt tears prick behind my eyes. He wasn't just making a joke, he was making a truth. Daniel turned to me and pulled a small, creased paper from his pocket. "I wrote these on a receipt this morning," he said, "because I couldn't sleep thinking about how lucky I am." He read his vows, and every word was a thread stitched into the seams of my soul, promises of patience, of listening, of laughter, even when I'm being impossible. Especially then. Then it was my turn. I hadn't written anything. I looked at him, at our circle of chosen witnesses, at the gold light dancing on his hair, and just spoke from my heart. I spent most of my life thinking love had to be earned, that I had to be perfect, small, quiet to keep it. But you taught me love doesn't arrive when I've achieved something, it arrives when I finally exhale. You are the safest exhale I've ever known. His jaw clenched. Eyes shimmered. No one breathed for a moment. Julian wiped his face with his sleeve. "You may kiss the bride before I start sobbing into the cider." Laughter burst from our circle as Daniel pulled me close and kissed me, not like a prince in a fairy tale, but like a man who had waited patiently for his future to say yes. Applause erupted, not loud, but real, full, the kind of clapping that wraps you up rather than overwhelms you. We spent the rest of the evening under string lights we'd hung between trees, dancing barefoot on pine needles, sipping wine from mismatched glasses, and eating homemade cake Amber had baked and decorated with sugared herbs. When she raised her glass for a toast, her voice was thick with emotion. "To chosen family," she said, "and finally getting what you deserve." I looked around the circle, each face a chapter in my real story, and smiled. I didn't miss the crowd I thought I needed. Because I had something far rarer. Peace. We crossed the state line into North Carolina just as the sky turned peach with the early breath of fall. Daniel's hand was on the steering wheel, his other laced through mine across the center console, as our little car climbed the winding road toward Asheville. In the back seat, boxes were crammed together like awkward passengers, pots and pans, old sketchbooks, our thrifted coffee mugs. Everything we truly needed fit into that car. Everything else, left behind. His grandmother's farmhouse sat just beyond a gravel path lined with sugar maples. It was quiet in the way cities never are, no hum of traffic, no sirens slicing through the night. Just wind, birds, and the distant shuffle of deer moving through the underbrush. We stepped out into crisp air that smelled like pine and wood smoke. Daniel turned to me, eyes squinting against the light. "This is it," he said, grinning. "Home." I stared at the small porch, its paint chipped but charming, the rocking chairs covered in leaves. The windows reflected the trees like they'd been part of them all along. And I said the words before I even realized they'd formed. "It feels like we're finally choosing our life." That was the difference. Not a life that was handed to us with strings attached or dictated by someone else's expectations. Not one we had to justify, explain, or defend. Just ours. Messy, quiet, real. The farmhouse was old but sturdy. Daniel's grandmother had passed it down to him with only one condition, that he fill it with joy. We intended to do just that. The first night, we ate grilled cheese on the porch floor, watching the stars come out one by one. No formal dinnerware. No plan, just us. I looked at Daniel across the flickering candle between us and whispered, "I didn't know peace could feel like this." "You earned it," he said. Maybe I had. I spent the next few days unpacking our lives slowly, carefully hanging my pressed wildflowers along the windows, setting my grandmother's lace dress in a closet lined with cedar. In the backyard, I began sketching ideas for a garden, maybe herbs, maybe dahlias. Something I could build with my own hands. Each morning, I woke up to birdsong and Daniel's coffee. Each night, I fell asleep with the window cracked open to let the wind speak its secrets. Atlanta started to feel like a faraway dream. So did the ache of being constantly dismissed, of shaping my life around people who saw me as convenient, not worthy. Here, in this quiet corner of the mountains, I could finally hear myself think. No one here rolled their eyes when I spoke about wildflowers. No one here belittled my joy. And in that quiet, I began to heal. I hadn't set foot inside my parents' house since before the wedding. But with the move complete and the Asheville house beginning to feel like home, I knew it was time to close old loops. There were still a few things left behind. Boxes of childhood books, photo albums, a jewelry box I hadn't been able to fit in the car the first time around. So one Saturday, while Daniel patched up a rickety shelf in the laundry room, I drove back to Atlanta alone. The air in their neighborhood felt different, tighter somehow, as if even the trees held their breath. I parked at the curb and sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the pale blue door I knew too well. No one was home. My mother had texted earlier that they were spending the weekend at a friend's lake house. "The garage keypad still works," she'd added, as if our last real conversation hadn't ended in cold avoidance. Inside, the house was pristine. Cold. Too quiet. I made my way up the stairs to the attic, each step creaking like a small protest. It was stuffy and smelled of old wood and forgotten seasons. Sunlight trickled through a small square window, casting thin golden lines across the floor. I found the chest almost immediately. An old cedar box with rusted hinges. One I remembered from every Christmas, where wrapping paper and ornaments used to be stored. I lifted the lid. At first, it was just layers of fabric, tangled tinsel, the faint scent of cinnamon oil from a decades-old sachet. I started pulling things aside carefully, expecting to find my jewelry box buried underneath. But then I saw them. Shreds, tiny, uneven scraps of cream-colored parchment, pressed wildflower petals, bits of twine knotted and torn. My breath caught. I reached in slowly as if the pieces were alive, fragile. My fingers trembled as I pulled out handfuls of the ruined invitations. My invitations. The ones I had spent days handcrafting. Not returned, not misplaced, destroyed. Deliberately. Some of the twine was still tied in my original bows, now frayed and limp. The flower petals, even in their brokenness, were unmistakable. Lavender, baby's breath, forget-me-nots. My name was visible on one piece. On another, Daniel's, this wasn't just carelessness. This was sabotage, I stared down at the ruined pile in my lap, my heart thudding in my ears. Lauren didn't just discourage them from coming. She intercepted them. She destroyed the evidence. She made sure they never saw them. All that time I had wondered, were the invitations too formal? Had I asked too much? Did they just not care enough? But this rewrote everything. I sat there for a long time, surrounded by pieces of my past that someone else had tried to erase. Then I did something I didn't plan. I gathered every torn scrap I could find, stacking them carefully inside a manila folder I found in the back of the attic. I smoothed them flat, gently, as though restoring a relic. And then I added a single note, folded in half, found in the attic, "Ask Lauren." The next few minutes moved in silence. I dusted off my jeans, descended the stairs, and walked into the kitchen. I left the folder on the kitchen table. Then I texted my parents. "Stopped by for the last of my things. Left something for you on the table." Emily, I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't need to. But before I left, I opened the fridge, poured a glass of water, and sat in the chair Lauren always claimed at Sunday dinners. I imagined her walking in later, finding that folder, her name staring back at her like a mirror she couldn't turn from. Then I stood, rinsed the glass, and placed it in the dishwasher. As I closed the door behind me, I didn't feel rage or sadness, just clarity. I didn't plan to stay for dinner. But when my mother called that afternoon, voice tinged with artificial brightness, "Since you're in town, why not join us tonight?" Something inside me said yes, not out of politeness, out of purpose. The table was already set when I arrived. The same bone-white cloth, the same matching silverware. A roast sat steaming in the center, flanked by bowls of salad and sweet potatoes. The scene was so familiar, so routine, it might have been a memory playing on loop. Lauren was already there, seated at her usual spot, chin tilted high, wine glass in hand, pretending to scroll through her phone like the room was too small for her attention. Our parents greeted me with forced smiles. I greeted them with stillness. The folder wasn't on the table anymore. My message had been received, and now we were playing pretend until someone blinked first. Dinner began like a script they'd rehearsed too often. "How's Asheville?" Mom asked, carving meat with careful precision. "Quiet." "Peaceful," I said. "We've settled in." Lauren didn't look up. "You always liked the mountains," Dad added, spooning gravy. "Good for your art, right?" I nodded. "And for being left alone." Still, Lauren didn't speak, but the corner of her mouth twitched like she was holding something back. I waited. The conversation limped along for a few more minutes, weather, traffic, something about a neighbor's dog. Every sentence felt like an attempt to steer the evening away from the envelope that had surely shattered the illusion hours earlier. Then, just as my mother reached for the breadbasket, Lauren struck. "So 35 and still solo," she smirked, tossing it out like a lifeline to the past. Dad chuckled out of habit. Mom grimaced, but no one else joined in. I set my fork down, gently, deliberately. Then I looked up at her and said the words as evenly as I could. "Actually, I'm married and moving with my husband." The room stopped. Lauren's smile faltered. My father blinked. My mother's hands froze above the napkins mid-fold. No one spoke. I took a sip of water, letting the silence stretch, letting them feel the weight of what they never bothered to ask. Finally, Mom found her voice, breathless and stunned. "What husband?" I reached into my bag, laid the manila folder softly on the table. Like a gift, opened it, and let the shredded invitations spill out across the linen. "This is what I sent you," I said, eyes fixed on my mother. "But Lauren made sure you never saw it." The twine glinted faintly under the overhead light. A torn sprig of lavender fell sideways against my father's plate. Lauren's face drained of color. No one moved. The room was full of ghosts, words unspoken, years of silenced truths. And for once, I didn't flinch from the weight of it. I just watched it settle around us, knowing I had finally handed back what was never mine to carry. Truth, unvarnished and undeniable. My mother reached for the invitation pieces with shaking hands, her eyes wide, searching. Dad stared at them like they were written in a language he had long forgotten how to read. But I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I had already said everything they needed to hear. The silence after my sentence wasn't peaceful, it was surgical. It sliced through the room like a scalpel. exposing the rot that had festered beneath years of forced smiles and unspoken resentment. Lauren stared at the shredded invitations like they might reassemble themselves and offer her an escape. But there was no exit now. My mother's voice broke first, soft and strained. "What husband?" I turned toward her. Her eyes were still locked on the torn paper, like maybe if she looked long enough, she'd find an alternate version of this moment buried between the petals. "I married Daniel," I said calmly. "A few weeks ago in a forest glen, surrounded by the people who actually wanted to be there." My father sat back in his chair like someone had just punched him in the chest. You got married without telling us?" he asked, voice caught between shock and indignation. "No," I corrected. "I told you, you just never got the chance to hear it." I watched the realization start to creep into his features, slow and heavy. Then, finally, Lauren spoke. "I didn't," she started, her voice shaking. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it." Everyone turned to her at once. "You what?" my mother said sharply. Lauren's mask cracked, just slightly. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a napkin she didn't need. "I didn't want to be left out again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You destroyed her wedding invitations," Dad said, flat and disbelieving. "Lauren, please tell me that's not what this is." She didn't answer. My mother gasped, hand flying to her mouth. "Lauren, did you really?" And then Lauren exhaled, like the truth had been pressuring her lungs for weeks. "I was jealous, okay," she snapped. "She always gets to be the strong one, the different one, the one who makes art and has opinions and leaves the room like she's some misunderstood poet. And for once, I wanted it to be about me." I stared at her, not with anger, but with something colder. Clarity. She looked at me then, her voice hitching. "You don't even see it, do you? How everyone always bends around you. You were gone for years, and the second you come back, Mom starts planning dinners again." I said nothing, just watched her unravel. "You don't know what it's like," she continued, "to be the one who stays, who shows up, who keeps the family calendar and takes Mom to her doctor appointments. I never got to be the mysterious one. I got to be the backup singer in the Emily show." That stung. Not because it was true, but because it was so painfully her truth. "And your solution," I said slowly, "was to destroy the one thing I created with joy, not because you weren't invited, but because you couldn't stand not being the center." Her lip quivered. "I didn't mean to ruin it." "You did anyway." Mom stepped in then, her voice trembling. "We always thought you girls would figure things out on your own. That sisters fight, but love eventually wins." I turned to her, calm but direct. "You allowed this favoritism all my life. You let her speak for you. You ignored her digs and called it teasing. And now, when it's finally cost you something, now you want to address it." They looked older than I remembered. Smaller. Lauren dropped her napkin and folded her arms. "So what now? You want me to grovel?" "No," I said. "I don't want anything from you." And I meant it. That was the most terrifying part for them, not for me. I no longer needed anything from this table. Not approval, not understanding, not a seat. I stood, calmly folding the edge of the shredded invitation back into the folder. "You don't get to ask me to stay now," I said, my voice clear as glass. "That moment's gone." I didn't slam the door behind me when I left. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just walked away. Sometimes the most deafening sound in a house built on control is the absence of someone finally choosing not to play the game anymore. We left the next morning. Not because of a dramatic ultimatum, not because of a fight, simply because there was nothing left to stay for. Daniel loaded the last box into the trunk while I folded the quilt my grandmother had once made, running my fingers over the worn stitches one final time. It smelled like cedar and old stories. I didn't cry. We had arrived in Atlanta years ago full of hope. I'd thought moving closer to family would bring me back into some version of belonging. But instead, it had shown me something far more valuable: what happens when you stop chasing people who only ever meet you halfway. I stepped out onto the porch one last time and looked back at the house. It looked exactly the same. Beige siding, shuttered windows, but the illusion was broken. I could finally see it clearly, not as home, but as the place I had learned to go small. Daniel came up beside me, resting a hand on my back. "Any last things?" he asked gently. "No," I said, sliding the key into the mailbox slot. "They had their chance." We got into the car, the autumn air crisp and bright, the leaves overhead beginning their slow, golden descent. The highway stretched ahead of us, long and winding and full of the kind of promise that doesn't ask for permission. We didn't speak for a while, just listened to the hum of tires against pavement and the quiet folk music playing low on the radio. Daniel reached over, wrapped his fingers around mine. "Are you okay?" he asked. I turned to look at him. "I think I'm better than that." He smiled, keeping his eyes on the road. We crossed state lines just after noon, and the second those North Carolina hills came into view, my shoulders dropped in a way they hadn't in months. The mountains weren't dramatic, no jagged cliffs or showy peaks, but soft and strong, like the arms of someone who never once asked you to explain yourself. The driveway crunched under the tires as we pulled in. The farmhouse stood like a loyal friend waiting patiently for our return. Inside, the air smelled faintly of apples and pine. We hadn't lived there long, but already it felt like hours in a way Atlanta never had. Daniel carried the last of the boxes inside while I opened windows to let in the cool breeze. I found myself unpacking without even realizing it, lining spices in the cabinet, stacking books by the window seat, hanging our wedding photo above the fireplace. In the picture, I was mid-laugh, head tilted toward Daniel, wildflowers tucked behind one ear. Not a trace of tension in my shoulders. No walls behind my eyes. Just joy. And the kind of stillness that only comes when you stop asking people to love you properly and start loving yourself enough to walk away. That night, we ate dinner on the porch under a blanket, sipping soup and watching the sky turn violet. Daniel lit a small fire in the pit we'd built with our neighbors, and we sat side by side in folding chairs, toes pointed toward the flames. "Do you think they'll call?" he asked quietly. "Maybe," I said, "but that's not why I left the invitation pieces. That wasn't about punishment, it was about truth." He nodded slowly. "They might not ever see it that way." "I know, and I meant it. Some people don't understand the damage they've done until they're no longer welcome to cause it. And some never understand at all. But either way, I wasn't carrying it anymore. As the fire cracked and the stars blinked to life above us, I closed my eyes for a moment and whispered to myself, "This is the sound of freedom." No shouting, no final speech, just the soft hush of letting go. 1 year later, I didn't think about them every day. That was the biggest shift, not that the pain was gone, but that it no longer interrupted my joy. The porch in Asheville had become my sanctuary. Morning sunlight spilled over the railing, painting stripes across my notebook as I sipped coffee and sketched the herbs growing in tidy rows beneath the kitchen window. Daniel was down in the garden now, humming off-key while replanting sage and thyme. Our world was smaller now and richer for it. We had neighbors who waved when we walked by. We hosted dinners where no one performed or postured. I had work that mattered and a partner who listened, not to fix me, but to understand. Some afternoons, I still reached for memories that hurt, like the way Lauren always raised an eyebrow before insulting me, or the way Mom would say, "She's only joking," even when her jokes left bruises. But here among the mountains, those echoes softened. I never confronted them again, never called to check in, never explained why I vanished. They knew, and one afternoon a letter arrived, cream envelope, my mother's cursive. I sat on the porch swing with it unopened for hours, letting the weight of it rest against my thigh like a stone. When I finally broke the seal, the first line stopped me cold. I didn't know what she had done until I saw the petals. There were no excuses in the letter, no elaborate rewrites, just sentences that sounded like truth and sorrow finally speaking the same language. She wrote about denial, about choosing silence for comfort. She wrote about watching the manila folder empty onto their dinner table and realizing it was not just paper. It was evidence of everything they had refused to see. And at the bottom, in the smallest handwriting of all, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I see it now. Too late, maybe, but I do." I folded the letter carefully and set it beside me on the swing. I didn't cry, didn't smile either. Because forgiveness doesn't always need a door to walk through. It sometimes just needs a window to be cracked open. Daniel came up the porch steps, dirt smudged on his cheek, holding a sprig of rosemary. "Want to press this?" he asked, handing it to me like an offering. I tucked it into my sketchbook without a word. And as the sun tilted west and the cicadas began their evening song, I whispered into the still air. Some people have to lose you to finally see you. Sometimes healing looks like silence. Not the kind that punishes, but the kind that protects. The kind you grow inside of, like roots stretching deep beneath the surface where no one else can pull at them anymore. It's been over a year now. Our Asheville home has changed with us. Walls painted soft moss green, shelves filled with pressed flowers and cookbooks, the garden twice as wide as it was last fall. Daniel built me a small studio by the window where the morning sun touches everything first. I draw there most days, barefoot, the sound of coffee brewing in the background. And I laugh now. Not the polite chuckle I used to give when Lauren made one of her digs. Not the strained smile I wore at family dinners to keep the peace. I laugh because no one's watching, no one's scoring, and I've finally stopped auditioning for love that came with conditions. Last week, I found a wild patch of forget-me-nots on a trail near the house. I picked a few, pressed them into parchment, and thought, this is who I am now. Someone who collects beauty for herself, not for others to approve. I still think about them sometimes, my parents, Lauren, not in a bitter way, just lightly. Like faded photographs you flip past in an album. A version of life that never really fit, no matter how much I tried to squeeze into it. They never called after the letter. Maybe because they knew I wouldn't pick up. Or maybe because they believed one apology should erase years of silence. But I wasn't waiting, because I'd already moved on. Not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Some stories don't need a dramatic finale. Some just end because the last page has been written and you finally set the book down. That was my family. And this is my life. I've learned that peace doesn't always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it's just a quiet morning, your hands in the dirt, someone humming off-key in the kitchen, and the soft, sure knowing that you're finally safe. Safe in your choices. Safe in your skin. Safe in the knowledge that walking away wasn't a failure. It was a beginning. So if you're watching this, and you've been made to feel small by the people who were supposed to love you loud, if you've spent years second-guessing your worth because someone else never saw it, let me be the voice that tells you, you're allowed to leave. You're allowed to build something better without waiting for them to catch up. You're allowed to stop knocking on a door that's never opened. And you are allowed, fully, wildly allowed, to heal in silence. Just like I did.